So today we're going to talk about how colors happen. How does the color happen? But here's the first question for me. I want you to think back to the very beginning of the semester. Your very first sloper, you generated the pattern how? Drafting. Completely flat patterning, right? Your second sloper, how'd you generate that pattern? Draping. We've gone through a whole series of different steps. Some of them involving flat patterning, a lot of them involving draping. Think about the sleeves and think about this added fullness sloper. Are these examples of pattern drafting or draping?
Draping only.
Kristen says draping only. Alyssa says both. What do you say, Connie?
Both.
I would argue that they are sort of a hybrid. That there are contents of both approaches that are thrown in, and for my brain, that's actually really, really helpful. It makes much more sense to me to use kind of a combination of both. For me, and again, I really want to stress the fact that I'm saying my brain, because your brain may work very differently than mine. I'm leading you down a path that makes sense to me. Hopefully it's making sense to you as well. I know that I can take a look at a flat pattern and it doesn't make as much sense as it does in 3 dimensions. And so draping is really a more effective way for me to visualize where I'm headed. But I also understand that to be able to create some of these 3-dimensional sculptures, I have to understand all those principles of the 2D drafting to be able to do things like slashing and spreading or manipulating darts or any of that kind of stuff. And I think that that's particularly evident in the sleeve project that you guys did. If I hadn't screwed around with the syllabus, you would have done a second sleeve project that would have made it even more visible. But I think that you still get the idea that there's some sort of combination between the two. And even though with sleeves, you start out solely in 2 dimensions via the sloper, hopefully, first of all, you're automatically starting to visualize the 3D that accompanies it, but you also start to understand that the 2-dimensional work is completely a hypothesis and nothing else, and that it doesn't really start to bear any fruit. You don't start to really understand it till you do that first mock-up and you start to work with it in 3D, and then you can see how the slashing and spreading and the manipulations are going to change it. The reason I wanted to have that conversation is because collars, I think, are exactly the same way. And in fact, skirts are the same way as well when we get into skirts. But since we're going to talk about collars today, I think it's particularly appropriate to have a conversation because I think it's kind of a repeat of the exact same stuff in a way. We've got a choice with collars to be able to start with it as a 2-dimensional thing or start with it as a 3-dimensional thing. So let's follow what we've done in class so far, or what we did at the very top of the semester. Let's start in 2D. Who has their first draped sloper pattern available?
Draped?
Yeah.
I have all my stuff in that drawer.
I mean, the truth is, it doesn't matter. It can be either one. So it's all over here?
Yeah, in that last bottom drawer is my drawer. I've got all the patterns in there.
Great. So let's find...
Probably on the bottom.
Oh, look, it's actually like organized in here.
Well, no, I just put things in and then close the door.
For the best.
But I would assume that it's
Now
the
it's-
button on the bottom.
Now it's disorganized because I'm digging into it.
Do you want some help?
What I'm really looking for is a matching front and back, which I think we have to go all the way back to the very beginning for. Oh, perfect.
Is that one?
Well, there's a back.
I didn't label that one. Oh, yes, I did label it.
That's a draped.
Are you looking for draft or draped?
Wait.
Doesn't really matter.
Oh.
Oh,
Drafted.
we'll start with this. what I'm looking for,
Am I a hoarder? Is that what this means?
no, that means that you're actually taking my class, because this is exactly the way it works, doesn't it? That's why I'm surprised it all fits in that drawer, because usually it doesn't work that way. The thing that's cool about collars, in some ways, is they're very similar to sleeves, in the sense that we spent time on Wednesday talking about the sleeve in relationship to the
Armhole?
armhole. What's the collar relate to?
Neckline.
The neckline. And so there is a certain amount of symmetry right there. The reason, oh good, you got a curve. The reason that I wanted a draper that has a front and a back, let me say that again. The reason I wanted a sloper that has a front and a back is because, what has it got?
Neckline.
A complete neckline. Tell me if this makes sense to you. Or conversely, tell me if it doesn't make sense to you. Let's say we want to do a collar that just looks like a little Peter Pan collar. What's the easiest route to generate the pattern for that? The easiest route to generate that pattern is to start by tracing the existing neckline of the garment. Because we know, much like the sleeve has to fit into the armhole, the collar has to fit into the neckline, right? So now I have a tracing of the complete neckline, right? Totally simple. I can then do this. Let's use Connie as a model. Oh look, I want a little Peter Pan collar that does this. Look, cute, right? So what do? I can easily just transfer that information either via like pouncing or something like that on here. I'm just gonna redraw it. Like that. I want it to come around the back like that. And what did I just make?
A collar pattern.
Collar pattern. As simple as that, right? Doesn't have to be any more difficult than that. You could stop right here, true all this up. I'd want to make sure that there's a 90-degree angle there. I'd want to make sure that when I cut the whole thing out, I have a notch right there so I know how it fits into the neckline. The only thing that I would be left to do is to figure out where the grain goes, and then I've got myself a complete pattern, right? Where would you guys place the grain on this pattern?
Here.
Catherine, show me. You'd put it parallel to center front. I saw Kristen do, what did you do?
I went like that. but
You went like
I don't
this, right? What were you going to start to do?
Honestly, I think, does it even really matter except for like the pattern on the fabric?
Alyssa makes a really interesting point. Does it really matter? You essentially have something that's circular. So if I put straight here, arbitrarily, I know I'm getting cross there, which means that that's cross. So interestingly, Kristen and Catherine actually placed it on the exact same grain, didn't they? And it means that I'm going to end up with some sort of bias right here, because my straight grain is right there, right? So Alyssa makes an interesting observation that because it's circular, does it really matter? It may matter a little bit based upon whether I'm concerned about the way that this edge lies, because if I put this on the straight, then it puts that on the bias. Or the way that this side lies, if I put that on the straight, then it puts that on the bias. But Alyssa actually makes a really interesting point. Say the second half of what you said.
So then you can base it on how the fabric looks and where you want the lines to go.
So what does Alyssa mean? Alyssa means, well, what happens if it's a stripe that you're making it out of? That definitely determines your grain, right? Because it looks like that. Or conversely, I could place it so that the stripe is going like this, because I want a cute little angled effect at the front. And so it may, in this instance, the grain may not matter, and so it may have to do more with the fabric itself. How difficult was it for us to generate this pattern?
easy.
Not so difficult, was it? There's a problem, I think, with generating a pattern this way. If you were to take this and you were completely mock it up and put it onto this garment, because this neckline is 100% identical in its curve to this, it's almost too flat. It'll actually fight itself because you gotta sew this to this, right? And because they're so similar, they actually start to not work very well. The whole thing, and especially for theater purposes, the whole thing, you might as well have just taken the original garment and drawn in a line right there, because that's kind of how flat the whole thing looks. So while this is a really easy way to generate a pattern, sometimes it's not the most effective way. So I'm going to show you two other methods for generating a collar pattern. One of the things that I said was this almost is too flat. It's like you lay the one on top of the other and it's trying to turn the whole thing into two-dimensional. Because since you've got one layer on top of another, it's automatically three-dimensional, right? But they fight each other so much, it's like it's trying to squish itself into the layer below. This is interesting because one of the things we talked about in class on Wednesday was the convertible collar. What's the convertible collar? Funny, I'm wearing one right now, I just realized. You know, it can do this, it can do this, it can do this, it can do all sorts of different things. But look, when I do turn it back on itself, look at the softness of that roll right there. That dimensionality starts to actually become much more interesting to look at. It's way more comfortable to wear too. And it's physically easier to produce in a sewing machine and on an ironing table than trying to do something like this. Can we turn this into a convertible collar?
Maybe.
We actually can, and it's pretty easy. One of the things that makes a collar interesting is this right here, the amount that it rolls up the neck, right? So I'm going to show you a little trick. And it's actually, this comes straight out of the book that's falling apart over there. Watch what I do here. Let's say we're going to do the exact same Peter Pan collar, but instead of it being ultra, I mean, because look at that, that's not really very attractive, is it? Or it's not as attractive. It's ultra flat, right? Let's say we want to give it some roll up the neck, like that. I'm really glad I wore something with a collar. Let's start in the exact same place that we started before. Let's take a tracing of our front sloper. Much like the sleeve, one of the biggest difficulties, again, that you've got with a collar is making sure that the circumference of the collar fits the circumference of the neckline. And so I love the idea of being able to take the tracing directly off of this because I know that they're going to physically fit together. I don't have to do any measuring. I don't have to do any truing up because it's already there. But watch what I can do here. Oh, I missed that corner. Let's pretend that's it. Instead of tracing it like this, watch what I'm going to do. Now I'm going to retrace. What did I do over here?
You need a dart.
I did. I made a dart, didn't I? If I take something flat and I put a dart into it, what automatically happens to it?
Gets more shape.
Does it get shape? Oh, it's that terrible word again.
Form.
It takes on form, doesn't it? It becomes three-dimensional, doesn't it? So what have I done here? I've started to force some sort of dimensionality into the thing simply by taking a dart at the shoulder. Did I really take a dart?
Well, you did a dart the opposite way.
What did I actually do? Because Connie's right, it is a dart, but what method did I use to make that dart?
Well, it wasn't exactly. Well, you just moved it.
I love watching you when you can't find the words because you sort of retreat into yourself just a little bit. That time you started to do this. What I did was I slashed and closed, essentially, didn't I? I took this pattern right here and I slashed and closed along the shoulder seam to be able to get this. We know that slashing and closing is just another form of darting. You know, it's sort of the difference between, I don't know, vanilla ice cream and vanilla ice cream. Vanilla ice cream with sprinkles, you know, they're, I don't know, I can't come up with a good example, but I think you understand. The thing that that book will tell you is if you follow their sloper directions to begin with, they'll tell you slash and close an inch and you'll get a 1/2 inch roll up the neckline. Slash and close 2 inches, you'll get an inch roll up the neckline. The reason I say it that way is because the math never works out. Like, it's a big fat lie so far as I'm concerned. But what is true about it is when you slash and close here, you do start to create a roll working its way up the neckline.
So in other words, the bigger the slash, the higher the roll?
You're exactly right. So let's take a look at that. I want to grab 2 more scraps of paper because I should have gotten a couple of scraps.
Can I
of
ask a question?
Absolutely.
So in theory, what's the theory of doing the dart the other way? Because normally when we do a dart, it opens up towards the seam and it goes, and it closes up as it goes towards the middle of the garment, or whatever the piece is. In the past darts, haven't we?
Say that again.
Well, normally we have the dart point like somewhere up in the fabric,
Right,
and then it goes down
right.
and opens up, and so we close it at the.
Well, I think that's why, in a way, I'm describing it more as a slash and close, because in a way, what you've just done is the opposite. Instead of one-sided fullness, we took fullness out of one side, right? So I think maybe it's more helpful to think of it in that way as opposed to thinking of it as a dart.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start again with this one right here. Let's go back and repeat what I just did. So I traced, I think in the first example, I traced the front, bless you, and then I manipulated the back. I can do it the same way here because I'm going to get the same result, right? Pivot that guy over, trace. Let's sketch in our Peter Pan collar again. Oh, Ted, it goes to there. Oops. Is that right? So there's example number 2. Take a look at example number 3. Let's start here again. And notice whenever I do this tracing, I'm tracing the shoulder seam, the neckline, and the center front or the center back. For me, that's really, really helpful so I can see the entire context of it. If I don't include the center front, for example, I can't really tell how this all relates to it. Watch what I do now. Instead of going just that far, I'm going to go really, really far this time. I'll go something like that. Let's sketch in my Peter Pan collar again. What do you see is happening as I move through the processes? How is the shape of the collar changing?
It's getting more straight.
It is becoming straighter, isn't it? This is something that's super, super important that we start to play around with. You've already actually started to play around with it a little bit, but in collars, it becomes particularly obvious. Many times when you go to assemble one of these princess seams, a lot of people, the first time out, they take a look at the relationship between the patterns and they go, well, this seam, we know on this pattern, that these pieces stitch together like that, right? This one, the curve is very, very flat. It's almost a straight line, right? Here, you've got a much more pronounced curve. And so a lot of times people look at it and go, do these really fit together? Because I start to pin them together and the fabric starts to fight, right? That fighting is a good thing because that's what creates the overall contour, right? Well, so take a look at what we're doing over here. We know that the neckline itself on this garment hasn't changed. So the curve is still a pretty extreme curve. However, what are we doing to the collar? It's getting progressively straighter and it's going to fight more. And so what's that fighting going to result in?
Some sort of contour.
More dimension, more contour. In this particular instance, it wants to stand up at the back. It's totally fighting. And I think that this is really important because this is the first time you get to see that we're actually using that fight to our advantage. We're using, in the same way, if you think about, say, a suspension bridge, physics is being used for that bridge, right? Because the truth is the bridge isn't really attached to the earth. The bridge is suspended from those, those tall standy things, and it's suspended right there. We're doing something similar here where we're using the tension created by the physics to be able to create the dimension that we want. To me, the other perfect example of this is roof structures. You have a roof, and inside the roof, you've got these little cross supports right there. And so the tension of the weight of all of this bearing down on that, and the weight of all of this bearing down on that, is what's keeping all of this from collapsing. And so weirdly, we're doing the same thing. We're taking advantage of the physics and the geometry to be able to harness it to create what we want. All that in a little collar. Did you know? This is why I think this shit is cool, because it's like, it really is engineering. It's just engineering with fabric and not with steel. So you can envision, if we were to take this to an extreme, what would our collar ultimately look like? It would ultimately start to look like that, right?
Almost a rectangle.
It would become very, very rectangular. What would it do by the time it gets there?
Would it stand up?
It would only stand up, wouldn't it? So with this notion of a convertible collar, now you can start to see the progression of what makes something convertible. Take a look at the shape of what I'm wearing. What is the shape of this collar?
Rectangle.
It's a complete rectangle, isn't it? The only thing that actually makes it convertible is the fact that it's a knit as opposed to a woven. So it gives it that sort of moldability.
It's on a dress shirt, and it would be completely straight.
It's not completely straight. We're actually headed there right now, but it's pretty doggone close. And what's really important to recognize here is what we've just started to do with a convertible collar. If we get all the way to this point, what are we at the foundation of? We're now at the foundation of a two-piece collar, aren't we? We had no roll up the neck. We had a little roll up the neck. We have a lot of roll up the neck. And now we only have roll up the neck. And the thing that's cool is now, because we only have roll up the neck, is there any reason we can't take a second piece and sew it right there and create the fall, the way it all falls down? Exactly, Kristen's choreography. And so I think it's really cool how the one-piece collar sort of leads into the two-piece collar. We've only worked in 2 dimensions, haven't we? We haven't actually worked in 3 dimensions. So let's look at it from a 3-dimensional perspective. If I wanted to, I could drape this entire process. So let's start right here. again, we can be relatively arbitrary with our grain placement because of the circular effect that we're ultimately going to get, right? So I'm going to take this, and the first thing I'm going to do, just for ease of draping, is I'm going to cut straight up along the grain, and then I'm going to start digging out a little bit, because I know that I do have a neck to try and accommodate in there. So just like usual, let's place our straight grain on center front and get it pinned down. Just like all of our other draping, if I try and smooth it flat, which I know I want it to be, I start to get all of this puckering at the neckline. So I've got to start clipping and clipping and clipping and clipping and clipping until I get the whole thing laying flat, right? Get a couple more pins back here just to hold it in place. Let's go in and draw in our Peter Pan collar. Let's start with our neckline. I'm going to go ahead and give myself that shoulder notch. I'm going to draw in my center back line as well. I need to go back and draw in my center front line just for reference sake. And then let's just sketch in that same collar. So it sort of does that. Like that, right? You can see, just by virtue of the way that it's laying on the dress form, one of the things that I was talking about a minute ago, it's wildly two-dimensional right now, isn't it? It's uber flat. And in the long run, when you go to make this, it's not particularly attractive on the body. Let's take it off, and let's take a look at the pattern shape that we got. Look at how similar they are. So you can definitely see the relationship between the two. Now should we play a little game? We know that to generate this, we essentially slashed and closed right there, right? So let's take a dart and see what happens. My pins are going to get in the way a little bit, just by virtue of the way that they're pointing. So let's go back to center back, put it in place. I could start at center front. Well, actually I am going to start at center front. Wider. So let's start at center front, get it pinned in place, and now let's get center back in place. Notice one of the things I'm automatically going to do is try and turn it so that my seam allowance goes inward, because I know that once I get it pinned in place, it's gonna want to roll. It's a technical term, gonna wanna.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, my pins are causing a little bit of a problem, but look at what we automatically got. It forces it to roll up the neckline, doesn't it? One of the reasons that I think it's particularly helpful to drape these kinds of things instead of just flat patterning them, or do what you've done with the sleeves, start with the flat pattern and then test it. Look at what happens here. We did start to roll up the neckline. What did that do to the width of the back of the collar? It did diminish it, didn't it? Initially it came down to about here, but now because the fabric has to go up and down, this particular element starts to become smaller. And so we want to see how it's going to work. As long as we've got roll, which goes all the way back to about there, we're losing some of our height or some of our width. So then I can re-drape it in. And of course, as you can imagine, if we were to go even straighter, we'd get more of a roll up here. So let's go to the opposite extreme then. Let's say that I want to drape a standing collar. We're going to follow a similar process. I'm going to start with my chunk of muslin. I don't need a ton since it's a small collar. I'm going to do exactly what we've done before on your other draping, where I'm going to choose a straight grain edge and then come in 2 inches from it to mark a straight grain line. I'm also going to take a minute and mark a cross grain line that's perpendicular to it. And that's going to be particularly helpful for this process, because you are going to repeat this on your own. At the moment, all of the garments that you've made close where? No.
Oh.
Actually, they all close in the back, don't they? That means that center front is my ultimate line of symmetry, right? So for this instance, that means that I'm going to start draping at center front and work my way towards center back. So let's go ahead and pin where my straight and my cross grains cross, right there at dead center front. I want this to fit closely to the neck, and let's say, for the sake of argument, I want it to roll up, I want it to stand up the neck pretty high. You know, maybe we're doing a Victorian collar or something like that. I'm going to start smoothing the exact same way that I've done in every other draping project. As we've seen, it starts to create a little bit of buckling, a little bit of puckering. So I'm going to start clipping as I work my way around the neckline. All I'm doing is stabbing into that moment where the two intersect, where the neck and the torso intersect. Let's give ourselves another clip right here. Another pin. Bless you. Another clip. I've essentially draped a neck sloper, haven't I? The thing that's interesting about the neck sloper is how many humans are going to enjoy wearing this thing? Not a single one who is actually breathing. Why? Because the whole thing, I mean, if you try and even swallow, this is going to be really uncomfortable if you try and breathe. So what I want to do is I'm going to try and backtrack a little bit from this and work a little bit of air in around the top. So I'm just going to do that right there. Try and get it to stand away from the neck a little bit so it's not quite so uncomfortable. And you can see that the way that I'm doing that is just by putting a finger underneath there and sort of manipulating the muslin. This is a perfect instance of when a stiffer muslin is a really good thing to work with, because since it is crisp, it wants to defy gravity, and we can start to get more of the form that we desire. And some of my clips are now too high, but I'm still, like for example right here, I'm trying to drape it so that that clip is closed, so it's not making a giant change. I don't really like the way that the back is lying here, because that's still, for mobility's sake, is not great. So I'm going to get another clip in right there, because it's fighting me trying to get some air up in there. Now I can get the air up in there. Now I want you to take a look at something. First of all, how do we do with getting air inside there?
It's better.
Definitely going to be more comfortable to wear, right? And especially if we're talking about stage. Whether you're dancing, whether you're talking, whether you're singing, sword fighting, there's not a single performer who's going to be like, oh yeah, make that tighter. My favorite part is when I have this one very specific memory of an opera that I worked on. I was doing the clothes for one of the female leads, and the designer had designed just a collar piece. You know, the dress came to here, and then there's a collar piece that was all made of feathers that did this. And she said, you know, I've got a real problem because especially when I'm trying to sing, if there's anything tight around my neck, I automatically gag. She's like, I think I was strangled in a previous life, and so, and so it's like, well, this is going to be fascinating, how to create this whole thing to be around her neck so that it appears to be tight, but so that it's not tight so that she can sing. Because, of course, the other problem she had was every time she took a deep breath, she inhaled feathers, which we had to work out as well. But, you know, anyway, let's go ahead and mark.
That's an interesting design choice for an opera singer.
Oh,
That's
it
really
came
funny.
out so beautifully. It
Yeah.
was so beautiful. And she was very, very happy with it. I was really, really proud of that one. And then let's just mark our top edge as well. There's something I want you to notice here as I mark this top edge. Am I marking the top edge so that it's parallel to the neckline?
No.
I'm not actually, because look, it's taller there. What am I actually marking it parallel to? I'm kind of working parallel to this, which is a really good approximation of the human jawline. If I were to keep going the same height back here, I'd start to get it all the way up into the back of the head. Now that I've got the whole thing marked, let me make sure I've got a shoulder notch here. Here's CB, here's CF. I want you to notice something when we take it off the fork. It is rectangular, the ultimate shape of the piece, but is it a rectangle?
No.
It's not at all, is it? This is super important. If you were to go to any of those fashion books I have over there, guess how they tell you to generate this pattern? You're supposed to do this. You're supposed to do this. You're supposed to plot the distance from there to there. You're supposed to come up a 1/4 inch and then connect the dots so that the collar looks like that. And in fact, if you were to take a blouse or a man's shirt and pattern the collar band, it looks almost like that. This is a perfect example to me of the difference between costumes and fashion. How comfortable is this to wear? Especially when it starts to get that high and that tight. Not so much. And in fact, you start to get buckling and all sorts of weird stuff. Take a look at what you've actually got here. You do have a rectangular shape, but ultimately it's almost more of an arc, isn't it? And the thing that I think is particularly interesting about this is take a look at how it does this. It comes across, 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 it dips up, and then it comes back down.
It's almost like a S or something.
It is. Why is that? And I find this S incredibly important. Why is this S incredibly important?
Because it accounts for 2 different types of curves. One that goes like a curve that goes convex around the back of the neck and then concave at the front of the neck.
That's a really good point. So again, it's very similar to the sleeve. Convex on the backside, concave in here. Why is the sleeve concave here and convex there? To be able to accommodate the musculature of the body, right? What's going on at this point on the human body?
That's the shoulder?
It's your trap. It's all of these muscles right here. You know, and again, I mean, we're not necessarily the most athletic group in the building, but I mean, look at Catherine. How much of a pronunciation does she have right there for that muscle? I can see it on Alyssa as well. Then think about like professional dancers. How big is that muscle? It's giant. And you try and pretend that it's not there by doing this kind of shape? Hell no. It ain't gonna work that way. So, guess what you guys get to do for your homework for Monday, besides working on your PowerPoint or whatever you're doing? You get to make 2 collar mock-ups. The first one is a draping just like this, a total standing collar, nothing else. So in a way, we're doing a neck sloper, right? The other one that you're going to do is I want you to do some sort of convertible collar, some sort of fun thing. You can approach this in either way that I just demonstrated for you. You can start out with a sloper that already has the full neckline on it and do this kind of manipulation. Or you can drape it. I don't really care which you do. When class starts on Monday, I want you to have 2 collars that are completely mocked up and 2 patterns for those collars. Let's talk for a minute about how to mock them up. One of the problems I think that collars create in a mock-up state is you go to put this onto a mock-up. In the long run, when this thing is produced for real, how much seam allowance are you going to have on all of the edges of this thing?
Man, it.
When the whole thing is produced, how much seam allowance do I have here? Here.
None.
None, or a very, very tiny amount. It makes mocking it up really, really difficult because, you know, with a sleeve we can add some excess in if it's too short, or in a bodice we can make sure we add in some excess on the side seam or the center back in case we have to let it out in the fitting. Collars present a real problem because if you leave seam allowance, you can't actually see what's going on. So, the way that I produce collar mock-ups and the way that I would like for you to produce these is actually relatively simple. If you think back to your, did you do a character sloper in your intermediate project in costume tech?
I think so, yeah.
Did
Yeah.
you do an intermediate sloper? Did you? I don't think we, no, you didn't because the class was a different format when you took it. One of the things we had you do is you stay stitch all edges and trim all of your seam allowance away except, well, I mean, it changes. For the purposes of this class, I want you to stay stitch all edges and trim away all seam allowance except a 1/4 inch along the neckline. So you have a way to be able to pin it onto the form.
So when you stay stitch, you just trim like as close as possible.
You
to
trim
that
right next to
stitch.
the stay stitch.
Okay.
So are we doing half of a collar or are we doing a
I
whole
want you to
collar?
go ahead and do the whole collar. It's difficult to see the roll or the stand because one of the things you can also envision here, what's one of the things that's helping this one stand completely up?
Pinning it to the neck.
One,
The fact that it has the center back.
well, yeah, but what's holding the center back in place?
You get a piece of fabric.
The other half of the collar is. This is another interesting conversation. When anybody shows me any design that's asymmetrical, I automatically go. Because this sleeve holds this armhole in place. This side seam holds that side of the skirt in place. And when you start to do asymmetrical crap, it will not stay. So this half of the collar is holding that half of the collar in place. Without it, you're screwed. So you want to go ahead and do the entire thing so that you can see how it behaves. In the long run, with your convertible collar here, get creative. You know, do whatever you want. The thing that's fascinating is collars, you can do anything you want. I mean, you see some that are like star-shaped, that stand up, and some that have little W's right there, some that are very, very pointy. You know, do whatever you want. Get creative. It doesn't really, it's a fun way to experiment to see what it becomes.
On the convertible collar.
Correct.
So when we're making the full thing, we just do one side though and lay it twice
Yeah,
on the fabric.
exactly. In this instance, with this example, because the closure for this garment is in center back, what are you going to do when you go to lay out and cut in relation to center front? Exactly. It's center front is now on a fold, which is interesting because where does that mean your grain has to be? It has to be on that line, right? When you start to do something more like this with the Peter Pan, you can't cut it on a fold because it's two separate pieces that come to a point right there. So then you decide where you're going to place the grain. But if it runs across a line of symmetry, then you're automatically cutting it on the fold.
So we can do one that just runs across. It doesn't have to.
You have to do one that runs across because you're all going to do one of these.
Okay.
So it will run directly across. And this one can run across if you want. It's totally up to you. Questions?